What does Milo Yannopoulos have to do with Michael Jackson? Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome back to PsychoBible. So Jordan Peterson just released, not too long ago, an interview with Milo Yiannopoulos, and he called it the Forbidden Interview. Now, Milo has been kind of incognito as of late. He still has his YouTube channel, I believe, but he's been deplatformed off of several other social media platforms, and all stemming from a controversy from a couple years ago. Now, first, who is Milo Yiannopoulos, if you haven't heard of him or aren't familiar? I first became aware of him back in 2016, around spring/summer. It was interesting timing because I had just finished my last course I need for my license as a counselor. And after I had already gotten my master's, there was still one more course I needed to do. And so I GIS'd, or Guided Individual Study, my last remaining course, which was multicultural counseling. And of course, when you take multicultural counseling, the main textbook on it, of course, is by Daryl Wing Sue. And that's where I first was introduced to terms like microaggressions and white privilege, and I managed to avoid a lot of those terms when I was in grad school up until that point. And what was interesting was I was taking it solo, so I wasn't in a classroom environment. I didn't have a professor telling me what to think. I had a professor who I met with a few times to sort of get my thoughts on what I was learning, and I got to interact with it sort of with fresh eyes. So but either way, I was being inundated with this material, and really was making me think, well, okay, this makes sense. And as growing up, as someone who grew up in a very white homogenous area, who is what everyone else would refer to as multiracial or multi-ethnic or mixed breed, it helped. Some of the terms like microaggressions actually helped give me a name for some of the experiences I grew up with. And so some of the stuff was starting to make sense to me. But then there's some things that I was like, I'm not sure where this is all going. And some of the stuff that they were labeling as racist or just insensitive was, to me, just maybe people were just being too sensitive. So, but I didn't really have anyone presenting other views. And then, so after my whole graduate school experience, I come across this video of Christina Hoff Sommers, Steven Crowder, and this British gay guy called Milo Yannopoulos. And they're speaking at a university where the students are being just absolutely belligerent, booing them and heckling and just shouting them down the entire time. And Milo, I'd never seen him before. He gets up there, he's got like a half unbuttoned shirt, and I think he's wearing shades. And his whole speech he prepared was just, feminism is cancer. And the crowd just goes crazy, and like they want to lynch him. And he says some other things, but that was the main gist of what he was up there to say. So it was like my first exposure to the anti-politically correct, anti-social justice warrior movement. And it was really strange to see this character, because that's exactly what Milo is. He's a very unique character. He's from Britain. He's now in the U.S. He is Catholic, yet also a practicing homosexual. Since that video I saw, he has since gotten married. So he's in a gay marriage. Yet he's very kind of self-deprecating and self-loathing, and at the same time he's very pompous and presents himself with a lot of confidence and arrogance and narcissism. Even though in this interview with Jordan Peterson, he says that that's mostly all just a sham. He plays at having a big ego. I'm not quite sure how much he's playing, but also when you hear his story, and also when you're familiar enough with guys with same-sex attraction, you know there's usually a facade of narcissism, or the whole drama queen facade is usually uh, a sham to some extent. There's usually to cover up a very uh, wounded ego. So, sure, yeah. At least he does actually show in this interview a lot of self awareness. Um, so he really is an anomaly. He's uh, a gay conservative who is a Trump supporter, goes against the narrative that the left was trying to push, that Trump is anti-LGBT, and here you got this, like, I mean, you watch the videos. I mean, like, he's a flaming homosexual. He's uh, and yeah, he's very conflicted about it. So because of his Catholic faith, he knows it's wrong, but also he not convicted enough to stop the behavior or to try to seek any sort of counseling in that area, but still wishes that he didn't have the attractions. So he's a ball of contradiction. And it was interesting, though, to see over the next year, after I was first exposed to him, all these conservatives and Christians, like conservative Christians, sort of prop him up as a mascot in some ways, until he wrote a book where he describes his own abuse by a Catholic priest. And he says a couple things in either interviews or in the book itself that acknowledge that this issue may be more common than people care to admit, and that it's possibly consensual on both sides. So he sort of fell out of love with the conservatives around that end. So when he started getting deplatformed, the conservatives really did not back him up. They didn't have his back through that whole ordeal. So there's been a lot of drama as well behind the scenes. There's even some love lost between him and Jordan Peterson, who really he would always talk about Milo, but I don't think he had ever really interacted with him. So he finally does this interview with him, and Milo's sort of coming back. He's recovering from the controversy and the loss of his reputation and stuff, and he's he's got plans to sort of make a comeback. So, and even since this interview with Jordan Peterson, Dr. Michael Brown has done another interview with him. He had interviewed him a while ago. So it's interesting, but there's a couple of things. I'm probably gonna make two videos out of this interview. There's this interview that Jordan does, because Jordan is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. You can't help but for him to ask the questions that any therapist would want to know. So these interviews he's doing, they seem sort of like intake interviews to start counseling. So he does some prying with Milo, and he even lets him know, hey, this is up to you. It's with your permission, would you be willing to discuss the stuff? Even though Milo expresses at times he doesn't really want to talk about this, but he goes along with it. So he perfectly can. He's a big boy. He can say, no, I don't want to talk about this anymore. But he does, and he indicates near the end that he kind of regrets getting into some of the material they went into as much as he did. But hey, he did. It's out there. And even though I think many of us, I hope many of us feel a bit weird watching the interview at times, sort of like we're being voyeurs. It does give us some really helpful insights into the psychology of a young man who is molested by an older man. And I couldn't help but make the connection between Milo and the stories of Wade Robson and James Safechuk, who are the two individuals featured in the documentary Leaving Neverland about their accusations of molestation by Michael Jackson. So I'm going to play some clips from the interview with Milo and then tie in some things from the Leaving Neverland documentary. I couldn't find clips from the documentary itself, but there is a CBS interview with both of them that gets into exactly what I'm looking to expound upon. So let's get to some of the key parts here in the Jordan Peterson interview first.
You know, when that conversation about your early childhood sexual experiences first came out, I listened to it and I thought that there was tremendous trouble brewing there, for a variety of reasons. And if you remember, I phoned you at that point and suggested that we had a conversation, and we made some efforts to manage that never came to fruition. And I always felt that was unfortunate. And so I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you about that situation. Because, I had a lot of mixed feelings about what you said, like many people. And they weren't particularly judgmental, by the way. I mean, so you correct me if I'm wrong here, because I want to get this story straight. You related some experiences you had with a priest who was twice your age, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, approximately that. You were about 14.
I think he was a little older than that, actually.
Okay, he was a little older than that.
It's difficult to judge ages when you are 14. I think I thought that he was younger than he was at the time, and subsequently found out he was perhaps 10 years older than I thought he was. It's difficult.
But there was a.
So that's something that's pretty interesting. There is, so he was about 14. The individual who molested him, he always viewed him as being younger than he actually was. So you see that there's something about his perception when he was younger that sort of warped the age of the other person to close the gap in the age difference. And this will play a big role later in the conversation here.
But there was a significant
age gap. Yeah. And so arguably he was someone who was in a position of authority, and that what he did with you was something that he shouldn't have done. And also, it's highly probable, given the nature of such things, that you were by no means his only, let's say, target. Now, when I heard you talk about that, the first thing that struck me about the way that you formulated it was your refusal to play victim. And I actually found
I didn't see myself as one.
I know that. And that actually struck me as rather admirable, because you came forward and said, this is an uncomfortable truth, but I was of sufficient age to have a mind of my own, and this was something I was pursuing of my own volition. And then
that is how I felt at the time. And
right.
When you talk about the abuse of authority or whatever, I've never met an authority I recognize or respect. People have to earn my respect. I have never encountered a person in a position of responsibility or authority who I have respected and deferred to merely by virtue of their office or their position.
Right. So it's
I sort of constitutionally don't recognize authority. So that element of it did not strike me until someone told me.
Okay.
That's. They're going to get into that, of course, how it took him a little bit of soul searching or it took revelation for him to get to that point of acknowledging that there was an abuse of power and authority. Throughout the interview, and even earlier before this whole section, he mentioned some things about his own upbringing that gives you some clues as to why he had such a low view of authority. His parents had a terrible marriage. Mom ended up marrying a man who was terribly abusive, or at least was emotionally abusive. I think he said he was also physically abusive. Dad really didn't do much to protect him, so didn't intervene in those situations. And so he had resentment toward both parents. So how on earth would he have developed any sort of respect for authority? On top of it, there's another thing. Jordan Peterson points this out as a virtue. And this is probably because Jordan is so big on uh, kind of the a strong work ethic and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and uh, resilience and taking on difficulty. Uh, I think it's tied into his maleness that when he acknowledged the abuse, he did not see himself as a victim. Jordan treats that as a virtue, and Milo considered that a virtue, at least at the time. He indicates, at the time I saw it that way. And Jordan is going to come and he's kind of, he's saying on one hand he admired that, but on the other hand he's going to use that to sort of lull him into a place of acknowledging that he actually was a victim. So, of course, he doesn't really have to do as much because Milo gets to the point of realizing that on his own anyway. But I think this is important for us to learn from because it really gives us a hint into how males perceive abuse. How so many of the guys I work with who are survivors of molestation, they don't always recognize it as molestation at the time. And they definitely don't want to, if they do acknowledge it, they don't want to definitely acknowledge how much it has affected them later in their life. Or they are completely oblivious to it. And that has a lot to do with the male emphasis on strength and not being victimized or being under the thumb of someone else. We want to be independent. We want to be the superior one in any situation. So to acknowledge that we were abused by someone and that impacted us and brought about some sort of defect or impairment in our life, that's a level of vulnerability we don't want to entertain or acknowledge. So it's a very male trait to deny victim status when it comes to molestation. Especially given his age, he was 14 at the time, so he's becoming a man. He doesn't want to admit that this was something that he had no power over. So I think those were some very telling words right there. Let's continue.
Now, despite the fact that when I heard you speak about what happened to you and my admiration for your refusal to play innocent victim, I also had contradictory ideas that I think were more a function of my clinical training. And there were two of them that I'd like to discuss with you. I mean, the first is, you know, when you think about yourself as a 14-year-old, you think about that 14-year-old as yourself. You don't necessarily think about that 14-year-old as a 14-year-old. And, you know, when you remember your 14-year-old self and then you go out and you see some 14-year-olds, it's actually quite a shock, or it can be quite a shock, because 14-year-olds are often a lot younger and a lot more clueless
than you
remember yourself being. You know,
yeah, I think I know where you're going with this, and I.
Well, and so
this is a really key part here, and it's really difficult when you're a teenager to see yourself as a teenager, to really have perspective about who you are. And especially we want to take on the world, we want to be a grown-up before we actually are fully grown, and you're on your way there. But boy, we want to be able to think we are capable of taking on adult decisions when we're not quite there yet. So it's really difficult to see yourself for who you actually are when you're that age until you're older, and then you look back and you see some teenagers and you're like, see them as, you think they're little kids. So you got a different perspective. So I love where Jordan is going with this, and you can see that Milo is tracking with him and already at the same place.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, because the second part of what I thought was that, like, it, and this is the incredibly tricky part of this conversation, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, one of the other things that got you in real trouble, apart from the fact that you wouldn't name the person that you interacted with, your abuser, so to speak, was that you made the unforgivable case, I think, publicly, that this sort of thing happened far more commonly than people were willing to admit. And I just, as soon as you said that, I thought, man, you're dead in the water. Because
it was interesting watching. Yeah, good.
Well, true that may be, it's not something that can be publicly discussed. It's not, I want you to again tell.
I went a bit further though than just that. I took it a step further even, and said that not only is this something that happens far more often than people are willing to admit, it is a function of gay life and gay adolescence, blossoming, whatever, and it is a proper subject for humor, and I insist on it being a proper subject.
Yeah, well, I wasn't even going to bring those two things up because I thought that just, that merely bringing up the first part of that would cause enough trouble. But I'm glad that you did bring the second part of that up. Well, because there's a serious conversation that has to be had about this, and the damn conversation hasn't happened. And I don't mean...
Gosh, it probably deserves another video on its own. Just that part that Milo just said there about how the grooming of young men or boys is a function of the gay lifestyle. And yeah, it's true, and people don't want to talk about it. And so yeah, this is pretty gutsy of Dr. Peterson to even have this conversation because most people don't want to acknowledge how true that is, or explore the dynamics behind it. So, but I don't want to get into that as much because that's not so much the point of this video. I might have to touch on that in a future one.
Specifically about your particular experience, although I think it's a way into the conversation. It's like the first question is, well, it'd be interesting to take apart some of your claims, and I'd like to do that with your permission. And I don't expect this to be an easy conversation.
No, I wasn't expecting to be, so go ahead.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is that it isn't obvious to me that even if you were a willing participant in what happened to you when you were 14, that justifies what happened to you on the part of the person with whom you were participating.
Well, no, of course it doesn't. But the way I apprehended it was that it was me.
Right.
And when I said a moment ago, I think I know where you're going with this. I can interject with a very small data point that I think explains how I think about this after some time and reflection, which is I have something now that I didn't have in 2017, which is a relationship with my stepson. And he is 16. And when I think, let's not finish that thought, but when I consider how old he is and put myself at that age, suddenly the horror that I see in everybody else's faces that I have never felt myself about what happened to me, and therefore has never been communicated from me, a sort of acknowledgement and awareness that this is not normal, and that this is a horrifying and terrible thing to happen to a small person. I never apprehended it like that because I just thought of that 14-year-old as me today.
Right. Okay, and that's exactly what I picked. Look, that's exactly what I picked up from your interview.
Until the last 2 years,
okay,
and now.
So that's so key is over the last 2 years, he ends up getting married. The man he marries has a son already, who's about the age when, even a little older, that Milo was when he was molested. And it took that experience for him to be able to imagine what happened to him happening to his stepson and then see how it was abuse. And it's totally changed his perspective. Whereas before he thought, well, I was a willing participant. This wasn't really abuse, or I didn't view it as abuse at the time. I was a willing participant. It was just a thing that gay men do with younger gay boys. And it took this experience of being a stepfather, even in a gay relationship, but nevertheless, the point is he had to develop a familiarity with someone who could represent himself at the age of the abuse for him to understand what actually happened to him. Before that point, it did not register. All right, so hold that thought. Keep that in mind for a little later.
Experiencing getting to know a child
Yeah.
as a co-parent,
Yeah.
as a stepmom, and now I get it.
Okay. So,
Now
okay.
I get it.
All right. So, I've seen this with my clinical clients, who failed to notice in some important way that the person they were sometimes decades ago is not the person they are now. And the memories they have from those times, which are appropriate to those times, are not the same memories that are appropriate to those times now, given their relative maturation.
I think that's fair. And I think it took that change in my life circumstances for me to jolt me into realizing exactly what you're saying.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions about that. So, what's changed in the way that you view what happened to you? And if you were interviewed, well, and I guess you are being interviewed about this right now, if you were being interviewed about what happened to you at age 14, I have 2 questions or 3 questions about that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the propriety of that? How do you now view your role?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the culpability of the person that I would say, in common parlance, preyed upon you? How has that shifted?
In the same way that there is, although it has been ruined by the progressives we both hate so much, a proper place for outrage. It is a necessary and right human instinct and emotion that has a place. There is also perhaps, much as it has been ruined by the progressives, a proper place for victimhood when you are in fact actually a victim.
Right.
And I think that now I perhaps realize that I was one when I didn't know that I was one in 2017.
Yeah, well, that's a hell of a thing for someone in your position to admit.
Right.
No, it's rough, man.
And I think that that's as concise and as true an answer as I can give you. And I think
so let's go into that a little bit.
The answer, because now I look at somebody I care about who is 2 years older even, and the thought of me at that age and someone taking advantage, suddenly I get it. I'm like, I would kill the guy. I would walk over there. I would shoot him in the head. Like, I get it now.
Okay, so that's a lot different. That's a lot different.
I didn't get it when I didn't get it when all I had to go on was my memories of being me at the time.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that struck me as so absolutely absurd about what happened to you in the aftermath of that interview was that I thought, okay, this is really, and it's exactly what I would have expected to happen to someone like you, because you're so contradictory, is that you actually had a claim to victim status, which you then refused to capitalize on, and then which people refused to bloody well recognize in the midst of the interview. Like, the proper response to that interview should have been something like, well, here's someone who's talking about a case of child sexual abuse, but hasn't realized or recognized that they were, in fact, victimized in that situation and hasn't come to terms with whatever that might mean. And so
This
then
is
to
not
go,
uncommon among people who have been through these experiences, because I have, since writing about this, I wrote a little bit about this in a short book I wrote about the Pope recently, and in the other things I've the brief mentions I've made of it since 2017. A lot of people have written to me with their own accounts, and this is not uncommon. I have discovered.
I'm sure it's not.
Who have experienced this sort of thing. And I guess there's some point in middle age where the penny drops. But yeah, I guess that there is a right and proper place to acknowledge and understand that you were a victim of something. Again, another thing that upset people, I think, another thing that didn't do me any favors. But look, I am someone who will always just speak it as I see it. And that will have terrible consequences, and it will have great consequences, and and that calculus will change over the course of the next few decades. But it wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me. And people find that a terrible thing to come out of your mouth, but it just wasn't.
So I love what he says there. I didn't get it when all I had to go off of was my memories of being me at the time. And it just shows, it's a good demonstration of how subjective, I mean, obviously, but it really does show how subjective our memories are, our memories of ourself, that they're not exactly the most reliable recorders of history. And so it took having to imagine someone else that we can relate to, imagine them in the same situation for us to get a more objective view of the circumstance. And so the light went on, and he saw that, wow, this was abuse. Wow, I was actually victimized. So although in the beginning Jordan Peterson's like acknowledging and sort of commending him for not playing victim, he got to the point of acknowledging that he was a victim, and it took some work to get there, or a grace from God for him to get there. So immediately this reminded me of the documentary on HBO, Leaving Neverland, which stirred up a ton of controversy because if this was about two guys bringing up abuse about anyone else, it probably would have been no big deal. But because they're talking about an American icon, Michael Jackson, and unfortunately he has since died, so it seems like they're just going after him and in the easiest way possible, and they just want money because they are bringing a lawsuit against the Michael Jackson estate. There's so many opinions about this, and people are saying they're liars or liars. But when I watched that documentary, when you work with people who are survivors of abuse, you will notice things that, like, yeah, of course they're telling the truth. That's exactly how guys I work with act. Their stories make perfect sense to me. And so Milo's story was like a confirmation of the stories of Wade Robson and James Safechuk in the documentary Leaving Neverland. So if you have doubts about the authenticity of their testimonies, I would say watch the interview with Milo. Because one of the criticisms is that how can these guys now, after all these years, say that they were abused, when one of them at least was a key witness in one of the prior lawsuits or charges against Michael Jackson that helped get him off the hook. Because another boy, Gavin, I can't remember his last name, came forward with abuse allegations, and Wade was called upon to be a witness, and it was his testimony that helped get Michael off the hook. So it's like, back then you were saying you weren't abused, now all of a sudden you are? Why'd your story change? And when you understand the psychology of someone who's been abused, particularly a male, you may have a little more understanding for Wade and James. And you'll see that their realization of their abuse was a journey, and there's a key moment in their lives, and it's funny, it was for both of them. First with Wade. Wade was one who first came to realization of the abuse. So you can see as you watch interviews, particularly if you watch, there's this in the documentary itself, but also in the Oprah Winfrey interview, that was sort of like an after show type thing. You'll see James, this is still fairly new for him, acknowledging the abuse and really working through it. You can see that Wade is a little further along in his own recovery. So he's a little more comfortable, in a strange way, talking about it. James, you could just see like the regression on the arrested development in the way he presents himself, the way he talks. And it's like this, when you see the footage when he was younger, this was a dancer, this was an entertainer. He was on TV, he was on stage with Michael, he walked around with such confidence. Now you look at him, this is a broken man. He looks like he has zero confidence. It's not a show. You just see it, that there's something that is holding him back emotionally. So, and it's so consistent in the interviews and the footage of him as an adult that tells me, no, he's either a really good actor or no, there's something that he's still working through emotionally. So let me play a couple clips here from the interview with on CBS about the documentary, and there's some key parts here that really parallel with Milo's own story.
Me how to French kiss, squeeze his nipples.
Did you know what was happening? Did you think that was inappropriate? Did it scare you? Did you think it was wrong?
A couple days prior to the abuse starting, Michael had already...
Keep in mind, according to Wade's testimony, this all began for him at age 6. Okay? Keep that in mind.
Already started being... He started touching me, just in the sense of like, panned on my leg, lots of hugs, kissing my forehead, rubbing my hand. So there had been this kind of development of physical closeness that was happening already that felt like a father, you know? Just felt amazing. And strangely now, for me looking back at it, when it went to the next furthest extreme of sexual contact, something about it felt like just the next step. And really quickly, as Michael started doing these sexual acts, he started talking to me about, you know, God brought us together. We love each other, and this is how we
love each other.
We love each other, and this is how we show each other our love. And then right away, the next part of the dialogue was, but if anybody else ever found out about any of this, you and I would go to jail for the rest of our lives. And we'd be pulled apart. Our lives would be over. Our careers would be over. We can't let that happen. We've got so much to do together. We've got to rule the world together.
Were you frightened by the actions or his words?
I was not frightened by the actions.
You were not. You did
No.
not think, this is creepy, don't
No.
touch me,
No,
this is wrong. You didn't think any of that.
No, I didn't think any of that. It was, out of all the kids in the world, here I am, and Michael chose me. And he also told me that, you know, I've never done this with anybody else.
Yep.
Yeah.
James, you're nodding in agreement to what he's saying.
Yeah, all this.
The
all-
conversation. Tell me what happened to you as you're listening to what Wade is saying. It clearly seems to resonate with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's all the same. You know, he did the same thing to me as well. He introduced me to masturbation, and then you start kissing, and I'm on tour, so we're together 24/7, and it's happening over a period of time. And then you're kissing, and he said I taught him how to French kiss. And then it moves on to oral.
See how he does that? He such a manipulative move to tell the boy that the boy taught the man how to do something. Oh, I didn't know how to French kiss until you taught me. It increases his idea of it being mutual, of being willing, of the boy being responsible and knowingly doing everything he does, not realizing the way he's manipulated.
Oral sex. It's like, can I kiss it? That kind of thing. That's what it starts with. But it's
Are
not.
you frightened or thinking this is weird or wrong?
No, it's in the context of a loving, close relationship. So
Or special friends?
yeah, there's no alarm bells going off in your head or any thoughts like that. Really, it's just, I love this person, and we're trying to make each other happy. And he said, I was his first, but even as a kid, you don't even know what that means. You don't even question it further than that.
Yeah,
know,
you don't say
still-
your first what?
Yeah, first what, right?
Yeah.
As an adult, you'd think
Yeah.
that, but as a kid, you're just like, oh, that's great. And you're special, and as well as we're not gay. We just love each other, and this is how you show your love.
He would say to you, we're not gay?
Yeah.
Did you even know what that meant as a little kid? We're not
Actually,
gay?
yeah. I mean,
did.
as soon as the abuse started, I had this question of, does this mean I'm gay now? That when the abuse started on tour?
The question James has, just this little side note, well, does this mean I'm gay? Gosh, think about that. For him, didn't necessarily lead to homosexuality. It didn't imprint in a generalized sense. It was like, well, with Michael, we do these things, but not with other guys. Same thing with Wade. It didn't quite lead to homosexual behavior with other men. They still ended up being attracted to women and just ending up with wives. Whereas you see with Milo, he did end up with a same-sex attraction. Now, there's more to Milo's story than just the molestation by a priest at age 14. And so, that's a video for another time. I know plenty of guys where their same-sex attraction began after an early sexual encounter with an older person, usually. And what you're seeing now, because of how politicized the question of homosexuality and therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction has become, there are multiple states that would prohibit a child from getting counseling when they've been abused and molested and are now wondering if they're gay. Now the question isn't even allowed to be asked. Oh, do you have same-sex attraction because of abuse? No. It's just taken as something totally separate. Well, you were abused and you're gay. Totally different, unrelated things. And so we can help you with the abuse, but we can't address the SSA. We can't address homosexuality. You're not allowed to discuss that as a therapist with a client, if the client's a minor, in about a dozen states now, and then multiple other municipalities and cities. So we're doing a huge disservice to adolescents who may link their same-sex attraction to abuse, but don't want to embrace a gay identity or lifestyle or behavior or relationships. So, little side note there.
If somebody else talked to you, he would notice, and then he'd question you. What did they say? What do they want? And he makes you fearful of talking to other people. And there's, when you're on tour, everybody's wanting to talk to you and, ask you questions. But
At what point did you all start to think that this is wrong? Was there ever a point that you started thinking this is wrong?
While the abuse was going on, so the abuse for me went from age 7 to 14 years old. I do remember when I was about 11 or 12, as I would see him less frequently.
Sorry. Age 7. You look at him now as an adult, and it's very easy to think that he knew what was going on. But you have to picture him, and you watch the documentary, you see what he looked like at age 6, age 7. And it changes your view. It really makes it real. I know people who are in my life, very close to, who are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And when you see a photo of them from the age when they would have been abused, it just messes with your head. I just can't fathom touching a little girl at age 8, age 6, in that way.
And then when I would see him, it was still just kind of back to the old business, right? As soon as possible, as soon as we could get into a private space, if he wanted to do all the sexual stuff again. I remember feeling around 12, starting to be a little more uncomfortable about that, and sometimes maybe trying to change the subject or, distract, but then having a fear that if I don't do this, I'm already feeling like I'm not a favorite of Michael's anymore. And if I don't do this, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to our friendship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were worried about losing the
Yeah.
friendship.
So it was a feeling like you need to do what he
Continue
wants.
this because you wanted to still be friends with
Yeah.
him. The public in general thinks it's violent, that it's very painful, that it hurts, and that it's very scary. But what you're describing is totally the opposite of that.
Right. Yeah, that was the thing, is that
Yeah.
the way Michael approached the abuse, the sexual activity with me, was always extremely tender, and again, began with hugs and embraces and kisses on the head, and then just kept expanding in that direction, but to a obviously much more twisted place. But yeah, there was never, he didn't beat me, he didn't, he never said mean things to me. It was all, we love
Wouldn't
each
have
other.
to.
It was all tender.
He made you feel special.
Yeah.
So this next part is key because it addresses what many people would think is the obvious question of why sue? Why go through with a lawsuit? This just seems to show that you guys are in it for the money. And I actually think quite the opposite, because when you've come to a realization of how you were victimized, you want compensation, and you are due that compensation. So to me, the point that they're fighting for something, they're taking it to court, shows me that they believe sincerely that this happened. Whereas, look at another story recently. Judge Brett Kavanaugh gets accused by Blasey Ford. And she doesn't take him to court. She just tries to make an accusation that would keep him from getting appointed to the Supreme Court. A committee's set up, they do an investigation, they try to make a determination if these charges she brings up have any merit. The special prosecutor takes a look at all the evidence and says ultimately, no, this would not stand in court. What does she then do? After the whole thing blows over, he gets appointed. What does she do? Doesn't pursue it any further. That to me tells me that she was not convinced that this happened to her, that he was the one responsible, because she was 100% convinced that he molested her or assaulted her. She would pursue it. She'd be like, I don't care, I'm going to get another opinion on this. I want my I want my compensation. I want justice. But she drops it conveniently. Doesn't pursue anything further. Doesn't pursue legal action against him. Once it all blows over, once her testimony is sort of dismissed and he's appointed. So big difference. Whereas if she were to pursue it further, even after that special prosecutor says, this doesn't stand, it doesn't hold water, she'd be like, no, it does. That tenacity would communicate either she's really crazy or she's sincere. That she is convinced he's the one who did this to her, if it actually happened to her. So the fact these guys are going forward with a lawsuit, it might seem that they're just money hungry to some people who are very cynical and just pretty much they just don't believe them anyway. But for people who see the rest of their stories and see how it all lines up, if this was about anyone other than Michael Jackson, you would believe their stories pretty much. So they are looking for compensation. Now what I hope they'll do, if they do win this case, is they'll share some of that money with Gavin, the boy who did testify when he was younger, and they didn't come to his defense then because they weren't ready. They weren't. So I would hope they would bless him with a portion of what they win, if they win this lawsuit or get a settlement. But they continue with their reasons for it, and I think their reasons for pursuing the lawsuit are insightful.
That I have and I do. Gosh, I wish it was different. You know, I wish that I was ready. I wish that I could have helped Gavin Arvizo receive some justice and some validation for what happened to him. It was just like what happened to me and just like what happened to James. And I wish that I could have played a role in, at that point, stopping Michael from abusing however many other kids he did after that.
Yeah, you're both admitting to us that you did lie in the past. The
Yes.
Jackson family and Jackson fans, as you know, are adamantly defending him and saying that you all are admitted liars. You're trying to exploit him. He is no longer with us. You're just opportunistic and trying to get money from the estate and from Michael Jackson. What do you all say to that?
It's an old argument that they've used for many, every time they come out with that. They say it's just about the money. For me, the lawsuit was about fighting back for little James. Nobody fought for me as a kid, but I'm old enough now to fight for myself. So win or lose, that doesn't matter. What matters is fighting. And so that's part of my process, my healing process.
I understand why that's hard for people to get, because it's really complex emotionally, psychologically. The way that this has evolved for me, after I fell apart emotionally in an explicit way with a couple of nervous breakdowns, which led to me disclosing the abuse for the first time to my therapist. Once I began talking about it after 22 years of silence, it initiated this kind of, everything I'd been holding down for 22 years started coming out of me, right? This emotional and mental and physical upheaval. And then some point in that healing process, I would say, I don't know, maybe 9 months or so in, what started arising in me was this question, first, how can I take this thing that happened to me, Michael abusing me, this horrible thing that happened to me, that shouldn't have happened to me, that shouldn't happen to any kid, but it did. So what can I do with it now? I mean, how can I take this bad thing and try and turn it into something good for other people and for myself? So from that question arose this desire, how could I tell the truth, and where? What platform?
So this next part is the key that connects this all to Milo Yannopoulos and the interview with Jordan Peterson and what was the key for him in realizing how he was a survivor of abuse.
But I try to look at it from their point of view, without letting them off the hook.
I think when you all had your sons too, the difference that made for you. Wasn't that a life-changing moment for both of you when you had your sons?
That was everything, my son being born. If I never had a son, I might still be in silence.
Really?
I think there's a really good chance. What I understand about it now is that I had become so disconnected from myself as a little boy over the years, through the process of kind of pushing all of this down, that I had no relationship with little Wade. I had no kind of concept or care.
See how they calls himself Little Wade back then. He's able to now see himself, the younger version of himself, as a little child. And it took Milo imagining his stepson in a similar situation to then see that he was a child or an adolescent as well, and not capable of making a consensual decision to engage in those relationships.
For in my mind, little
And in
Wade.
your son, did you see yourself as a little
That's
boy?
what happened. I started having visions or images of what happened to me happening to my son, and I saw images of Michael doing it to my son, and that was the first time that those kind of thoughts in relation to Michael ever had an extremely negative, scary, emotional reaction in me. You know, it was once I could see, really understand, this is what a little boy looks like and feels like and thinks like and behaves like. And this is what innocence feels like. And that was me.
So if there's one major takeaway that we can get from all these stories, I think it would be to speak up. If you experienced a sexual relationship of some sort at a young age with someone who is an adult, you may not recognize it as abuse or as molestation, or you may not even see yourself as a victim like Milo and like Wade and James did. They did not recognize themselves as victims. Nevertheless, you might want to run that by someone. So if you're a young man and you can relate to their stories, but yet you still like, well, I'm not a victim. It didn't affect me. You might want to still share that with someone. And if you're now older, and you may think, well, the ship has sailed. It's over. It's in the past now. You might want to share that with someone. Even if it's been years later. Even if you're not suffering. There's a part of the interview with Jordan Peterson where Milo would say that the abuse didn't have as much of a negative effect on him. I would beg to differ, but they struggle a little bit. He wonders what the long-term consequence may be. So that's a video for another time. Whereas for Wade and James, you see it definitely had an impact on them. Now there's a bit of a difference in that maybe in your life, maybe for you is a one-time encounter. Whereas for James and Wade, this lasted years. So the frequency, the age at the time of the abuse are major factors in the impact it'll have on you over time. So realistically, that is something to acknowledge. Nevertheless, there may be more subtle ways that the abuse may impact you. And there may be something else to consider as well, is why were you a target? That you may want to explore with someone, like a counselor, a trusted friend, a mentor. Because usually a predator is a bit picky with their targets. And even if it's on an unconscious level, they may not know why they're drawn to a particular child or why they singled out a particular child. But there tends to be that they're choosing a child who seems more vulnerable, more alone, more in need of connection. So that may be an issue that existed prior to the abuse that you might want to explore with someone. There may be other incidents that happened prior to this particular abuse that you maybe just didn't realize were significant. So you may want to consider sharing with someone, even if it doesn't seem like it was traumatic. You don't know, once you start to share, what other connections you might start making. So that's my encouragement to you. Even if it's years later, even if you don't believe you're a victim, even if you don't believe you're suffering, you may want to, for your own good, share some things with someone else who's trustworthy, who will be willing to listen to you and not pressure you to do anything with that information, but will at least listen to you and allow you to share your story at your own pace. There's another reason why you may want to share, and that's because you do not know who else may be in danger by that same person. And even if it didn't impact you as much, you starting to share your story and getting it out there, if you potentially go so far as to make it public, there may be another victim who, for years, was going to take it to their grave. And that's the case with James. It wasn't until Wade shared his story that James saw him as like, wait, he's describing me. That's what I went through. That was abuse. And so that's where he had to acknowledge things. But it took him hearing Wade's story for him to make that connection. So you don't know, by you sharing your story, even if you're like, well, it's not that big a deal for me, it might be a big deal to someone else. And you having strength to share your story may be a blessing of God, maybe a grace that God is giving you so that you can set an example for others, that you can be a beacon to others that, hey, I'm going to share this, and if you can relate, I want you to know that you're not alone. But also, that person may still be out there. That perpetrator may still be out there and may still be abusing others. And someone, maybe there's a statute of limitations for you, but maybe for someone, there is no limitation. And they may need to take action. They may have the opportunity to take action. So this is an issue I'm very, very passionate about as a counselor, but also as a husband. My wife, Jessica, is a survivor of childhood abuse in multiple ways. And just this past year, 2018, she started to share her story. For years, I mean, she's even older than I am. So for decades, literally, she kept her story a secret. And over the past couple of years, it's been a journey for her to start sharing with her family what happened. And now through music. We write music together. But her first song, her first single, where she's trying to start a music career, but we just want to minister with music. So the first song that we released was one that she wrote herself. It's the first song she ever wrote, and it's called Time to Fly. And it is about her coming to a realization of her own childhood sexual abuse and how it has held her back. And that it's time for her to work through it. And she gives a word of encouragement to others who are survivors, whether you're older like her or younger and still going through it. So I'm going to leave a link to the video on YouTube of that song, and I would encourage you to check it out. We're not looking to make a ton of money off this. We just want this song to get out there to bless others, to hopefully be encouragement to others. So if you can relate, I hope that it will bless you. But more importantly, if you are suffering from the effects of childhood sexual abuse, I pray that you will muster up what courage you need to help someone and get the help you need. And if you are a survivor but feel like you're not a victim, guess what? Then maybe God is giving you that strength so that you can be a support to someone else. And you can at least relate to a degree, but you at least but you have the strength that you can be a support, not just a fellow victim. So I pray you consider that. Alright. Feel free to interact with me in the comment section. If you are appreciating the content I'm creating, please subscribe, like, share the videos, and I'll see you next time. God bless.